From well-known classics like dysentery and leprosy to diseases like smallpox and scarlatina that used to be apocalyptic and now hardly affect us, these Dark Age plagues haunted our ancestors. First, of course, is the Black Plague. The most famous and devastating plague in history, the Black Plague, or Yersinia pestis, utterly devastated the population of Europe. It wiped out half the population of Eurasia in the span of just 4 years. That is hundreds of millions. It's suspected the Golden Horde actually brought the disease to Europe, and by that point it was far too late. The filthy living conditions lent themselves to not only infection, but fleas as well, and it's these flea bites that primarily spread the epidemic. Yersinia pestis can infect either through open sores and wounds, or through inhalation. If you breathe it in, it's called pneumonic plague, and if you get it through a lesion or sore, it's the bubonic plague. They manifest slightly differently, with pneumonic affecting the lungs heavily, while bubonic is most recognizable for attacking the lymphatic system, leading to swollen and painful glands in the armpits and elsewhere, eventually leading to septicemia and rot taking the person. Over the 6 different bubonic plagues, between 57 and 168 million people lost their lives, with the most recent outbreak lasting until 1960. Next is dysentery. Known as the flux, dysentery is one of the most common and pervasive diseases in human history. Now, you'd think it's common sense to not have your waste products go into, say, your drinking water and food, but for most of human history that was not common knowledge. Dysentery causes severe diarrhea, which in severe cases can cause fatalities through dehydration. Basically everyone had dysentery though. It's a fairly survivable disease if it doesn't get too bad and you get enough fluids, and it's thought most people would experience dysentery at some point in their lives. It was even worse for armies on the march, however. Turns out going camping with 30,000 of your best buds is not exactly hygienic and is a great way to spread dysentery. Dysentery is to this day often known as the soldier's sickness, as soldiers even in modern times on the move through hostile territory are likely to not have safe sources of food and drinking water, not to mention their close proximity to injury and disease. Next is cholera. The big sister of dysentery, cholera is significantly more dangerous and lethal. While dysentery is common amongst armies, cholera was the destroyer of cities. Though the red diarrhea of dysentery is disturbing and dangerous, cholera can prove lethal in just hours. Once contracted, cholera causes a purge of your body through every end. The infected lose so much water from these purges that they can perish just hours after symptoms begin. Symptoms can also be so severe that even constantly drinking water will not keep you hydrated. Even worse is that cholera is most often contracted through contact with contaminated water, meaning there likely isn't enough clean water available to treat the sick. Despite its horrific nature and ability to wipe out entire communities when a single well gets infected, cholera is also responsible for our discovery of germ theory, as it was discovered to be connected to infected water. Next is leprosy. Leprosy is one of the most famous biblical diseases and was widespread and seriously infectious, especially because people's skin was so filthy. They rarely washed and did so without soap in cold water, which does little to eliminate bacteria on the skin. This led to horrific lesions and infections in all classes, from the rich to poor, and also allowed leprosy a place to fester. Leprosy primarily causes a deadening of nerves, but can also damage the respiratory tract, the skin, and eyes. Most often, individuals with leprosy will not feel their injuries, infections, and other damage done to their bodies, which is why lepers are often depicted as missing digits or limbs. At least lepers could go straight to heaven, as they were already considered to be living in purgatory. Next is typhoid. Typhoid was another disease commonly associated with soldiers, and was even known as camp fever. Again, with the poop, typhoid is carried by humans and is spread by contact with infected human feces carrying the Salmonella enterica bacterium. During the siege of Antioch in 1098, the Crusader camp was ravaged by typhoid, which without antibiotics is highly dangerous. This wasn't the only time either. Typhoid begins with a low fever that steadily gets worse day by day, followed by muscle fatigue, severe head and body aches, severe weight loss, and more. Before antibiotics, typhoid was usually highly lethal, as unless the individual's immune system could fight it off, they had no hope of recovery. Even among those who recover though, typhoid continues to be a threat. They will shed typhoid bacteria for weeks afterwards, and around 1 in 10 survivors will carry the bacteria and spread it for the rest of their life. It's probably best that it was so lethal, as that likely prevented it from spreading as severely as other diseases. Next is the flu. flu. The common flu may seem like little more than a seasonal nuisance to us now, but before modern science-based medicine, it was a massive threat. In 1557, influenza broke out and spread across the entire world. Beginning in Asia, it was brought over trade routes into Europe, Africa, and even the Americas. The disease was devastating, but the toll is unknown as it spread so far and so fast that it outstripped whatever 16th century reporting methods there were. This was, however, the first time that numerous governments began to bring physicians in to dictate bureaucracy and policy around the control of epidemics, which opened the door for far more meaningful changes in medicine to be made. Influenza got so bad, though, that numerous governments and states were forced to essentially shut down, closing their courts and parliaments to prevent the spread. Next is scarlet fever. Scarlet fever, or scarlatina, is primarily a disease contracted by the very young and very old, and as such was a real scourge of the pre-antibiotic days. Diseases with its symptoms were described as early as Hippocrates himself in the BC 400s. It was highly lethal without strong medical attention, and even then it could often not be controlled. Scarlet fever is brought on by exposure to the bacteria, but can also come from any regular strep throat infection. Today, we don't even think of it as a danger. It's a very, very simple series of antibiotics that quickly destroy the bacteria. But even as little as a few decades ago, it was a horrific danger. My Nana, for instance, lost friends in elementary school to scarlet fever. Next is syphilis. If people couldn't tell that drinking poop water was a bad idea, how in the world would they have known about STDs? Well, they sort of did. I mean, how many times can you get itchy after the horizontal mambo and not realize how it happened? But also, the full extent of the disease was truly not known. 2 to 6 weeks after initial contact, a lesion or multiple lesions will form at the infection site, usually in the private areas. This lesion is what spreads the disease and is simply filled with infectious spirochetes. These lesions will get worse without treatment, but after 4 to 10 weeks, secondary syphilis sets in. This involves the spread of rashes that can also become papular or pustular, with multiple lesions in close proximity. This is painful, infectious, and embarrassing. Fever, weight loss, and hair loss are also possible symptoms, but if still left untreated, syphilis will progress to tertiary. This can involve severe brain damage or neurosyphilis, heart damage or cardiovascular syphilis, and perhaps the most recognizable is gamatis where it causes the growth of numerous soft, fleshy tumors on multiple parts of the body. Thankfully, today, syphilis is very easily treated with antibiotics. Next is smallpox. One of the most horrifying diseases of the pre-modern era, smallpox is not only incredibly infectious and highly lethal, but is also disfiguring and horrifying in its impacts on the body. This is not cholera or dysentery where everything is happening inside the body. Smallpox, even if survived, causes long-lasting physical external impacts. The very first immunization techniques developed in ancient China were actually to protect against smallpox, and even though that was basically just intentionally infecting people, it was the first of many steps to proper immunization. But smallpox was, perhaps most famously, used as a biological weapon against the American indigenous people. Most Europeans had already had generations of contact, and like chickenpox, once you've survived it once, you're much more likely to survive or simply never get it again. But the American tribes, who lived in less squalor and lower densities, had not built up this resistance over decades of disease. Smallpox had a near total fatality rate, and its intentional introduction through infected blankets and other items ensured that it spread deeply and widely through indigenous communities. On a slightly lighter note though, it is the only disease to be eradicated, with the last case in the wild occurring in 1977. And finally is diphtheria. Diphtheria can be tracked back to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians, however wouldn't become widespread in Europe until the 1700s. Likely due to urbanization, poor hygiene, and close contact with the infected, it became a scourge, targeting the young primarily and ending thousands of lives. One of the most horrifying aspects is that as the disease destroys your body, a gray pseudomembrane begins to grow in the lungs and throat. This can become hard and rock-like and can even block airways. It's made of all of the destroyed cells your body is trying to get rid of, which in severe cases can lead to severe difficulty breathing and a horrific cough known as croup. It also causes lesions of infection on the body and can lead to heart disease and the destruction of neurons and nerves in the brain. It was one of the first successful vaccinations, however, with the first one being developed in 1890. Those were Dark Age plagues that haunted the medieval times. I hope you learned, and I'll see you next time.